On a crowded street corner in Chicago, a black nurse stood trembling, struggling to steady herself after being unfairly fired from her job. But when she saw a white man collapse on the sidewalk, her instincts as a nurse took over, snapping her focus back into place. Ignoring the murmurs of doubt from the gathering crowd, she dropped to her knees beside him, steady, focused, unwavering. And because of that single act of kindness, 24 hours later, 4 luxury cars were parked outside her home, bringing her an opportunity she had never imagined possible. Aaliyah Carter had always believed that hard work and dedication would secure her place in the world. She had spent 6 years at Memorial West Hospital, giving everything she had to her patients, working overtime, picking up extra shifts, staying late even when she wasn't asked. She had been there during the worst nights when the ER was overflowing, when patients had no one to hold their hand but her. And yet, as she sat in the cold, sterile office of Dr. Karen Whitmore, watching the woman shuffle a stack of papers without meeting her eyes, Aaliyah realized none of it had mattered. "I'm sorry," Aaliyah Whitmore said, her tone smooth but distant, rehearsed. "The hospital is facing financial difficulties, and unfortunately, we're forced to make some difficult decisions. We've had to let a number of people go." Aaliyah's fingers dug into her palms. She knew how this game worked. They weren't firing a number of people. They were firing her. She had seen the staff list earlier that week. None of the younger, less experienced white nurses were on it. They weren't being cut. No, just her and a few others who looked like her. Her stomach twisted, but she kept her face blank. "So, just like that," she said, her voice steady even as rage bubbled underneath. 6 years. "And you're telling me it doesn't count for anything?" Whitmore sighed, finally looking up, her blue eyes filled with something that almost resembled pity. "Almost. It's not personal, Aaliyah. You're a good nurse. But these decisions come from above. My hands are tied." Aaliyah clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to laugh bitterly. Not personal. Of course it was. It was always personal when it came to people like her. When the budget got tight, when tough choices had to be made, somehow it was always the black staff, the ones who had to work twice as hard just to be seen as competent, who ended up being let go. She could argue. She could demand an explanation. She could tell Whitmore that she knew this wasn't just about budget cuts. But what would it change? She had seen this happen before, and she knew how it ended. So instead she stood. "Right," she said, her voice clipped. "I'll collect my things." Whitmore offered her a sympathetic smile, as if that meant anything. "Again, I'm sorry." Aaliyah didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked out, keeping her head high even as fury burned in her veins. By the time she stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Unemployment, rent due in 2 weeks. A mother who relied on her. Years of sacrifice gone. The city moved around her, indifferent, fast-paced, unforgiving. She shoved her hands into her coat pockets and started walking, her mind a blur of worry and anger. It wasn't fair, but fairness had never been a part of her reality. "Ban da noi. Viat lai theo gyan van kuan, mu ti a kong gin, boi kan, kam chuk, tam qua tom non veit tang kan chide ktot. ChatGPT da noi." Aaliyah Carter sat stiffly in the worn-out chair across from Dr. Karen Whitmore's desk, her back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. The office smelled sterile, like antiseptic wipes and the faint trace of coffee gone cold. A single window behind Whitmore's desk let in the gray, overcast light of a Chicago afternoon, casting sharp shadows across the mahogany furniture. Outside, the faint hum of the hospital carried on as usual muffled conversations. The distant beeping of heart monitors, the sound of gurney wheels rolling across linoleum floors. But inside this office, everything had come to a dead stop. Dr. Whitmore sat across from her, flipping through a stack of neatly arranged papers, her manicured nails clicking against the polished desk as she tapped them together absent-mindedly. Aaliyah had worked under Whitmore for 6 years. She knew that look, the one that said Whitmore was about to deliver bad news, but was hoping to make it sound like an unfortunate necessity rather than a deliberate choice. Aaliyah's stomach tightened. She already knew what was coming. Whitmore finally sighed and set the papers down, folding her hands over them, as if that somehow softened what she was about to say. "Aaliyah, I want you to know this isn't easy for me," she started, her voice carefully controlled, the same tone Aaliyah had heard her use with grieving families. "The hospital is facing severe financial difficulties, and we've had to make some difficult decisions." Aaliyah didn't flinch, but she felt her fingers dig into her palms. "Difficult decisions," she repeated, her voice even. "Like letting me go." Whitmore exhaled through her nose, a soft, performative sigh. "A number of staff members have been affected. This isn't about performance. You're an excellent nurse, Aaliyah, truly. But with the budget cuts." Aaliyah's jaw clenched. Budget cuts. That was always the excuse, wasn't it? She had seen the staff list earlier that week. She knew damn well who had been let go. And more importantly, who hadn't. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice still calm, but laced with a quiet steel. "You're telling me that out of all the nurses in this hospital, the one being let go just happens to be me. After 6 years. Whitmore hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Aaliyah caught the flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, discomfort, or maybe just the realization that Aaliyah wasn't going to accept this quietly. But just as quickly, the carefully neutral expression returned. "It's not personal, Aaliyah," she said smoothly. "These decisions come from above. My hands are tied." A bitter laugh almost escaped Aaliyah's throat, but she swallowed it down. Not personal. Of course it was. It was always personal when people like her were involved. When things got tight, when tough choices had to be made, somehow it was always the black staff, the ones who had to work twice as hard just to be seen as competent, who found themselves let go. Aaliyah took a slow breath, willing herself to stay composed. She could fight. She could demand an explanation. She could call it what it was, blatant discrimination wrapped up in corporate jargon. But she knew how this played out. She had seen it before. So instead she nodded once, sharply, and pushed back her chair. "Right," she said, her voice clipped but steady. "I'll collect my things." Dr. Whitmore's face softened into something that might have been sympathy, or at least a good imitation of it. "Again, I'm sorry." Aaliyah didn't bother responding. She turned and walked out, her steps measured, controlled. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But by the time she stepped outside into the biting autumn air, the weight of it all crashed down on her. The hospital doors slid shut behind her with a quiet hiss, cutting her off from the building she had given years of her life to. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, her breath visible in the cold air, the distant sounds of Chicago's streets humming around her. Cars honked. People rushed past, bundled in thick coats, their faces buried in their phones or locked in quiet conversations. Life went on. But for her, everything had just come to a halt. Unemployed. Just like that. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Bills stacked on her kitchen counter, unopened because she already knew what they said. Her mother needed her. She had worked too damn hard for this for them to be discarded so easily. She clenched her fists in her coat pockets and started walking, letting the city swallow her up. It wasn't fair. But fairness had never been a part of her reality. The cold wind bit at Aaliyah's face as she walked, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her thin coat. The city bustled around her, indifferent to the storm raging inside her chest. People moved with purpose, taxis sped past, the rhythmic hum of Chicago's heartbeat steady and unyielding. But for Aaliyah, the world had tilted off its axis. She had spent 6 years inside that hospital, sacrificing sleep, personal time, even her own health to be there for patients who had no one else. And yet, in the end, she had been tossed aside like she was disposable. She barely registered the blocks passing beneath her feet, her thoughts a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and the gnawing anxiety of what came next. What now? Rent was due. Bills were piling up. Her mother needed her. She had worked too damn hard to get here, clawing her way through nursing school while juggling 2 jobs, only to be cut loose, as if none of it mattered. A sharp gust of wind whipped through the streets, making her shiver. She hugged herself tighter, quickening her pace as she passed the upscale shops and cafes of downtown. She never had time for places like these. They belonged to people who had never known struggle, people who didn't wake up every morning wondering if they'd have enough to make it through the next month. People like Dr. Whitmore, who could sit behind a desk and talk about tough decisions while knowing damn well they wouldn't affect her. A sudden commotion up ahead caught her attention. A small crowd had gathered near the sidewalk outside an expensive-looking cafe, murmuring in hushed, urgent voices. Aliyah slowed her steps, instinct kicking in before she even fully processed what was happening. Then she saw him. An older man lay sprawled on the pavement, his skin ashen, his body eerily still. A few bystanders stood frozen, their faces twisted in concern but their feet glued to the ground. A woman clutched her chest, whispering, "Oh my God." A man in a tailored suit fumbled with his phone, muttering something about calling 911. But no one moved. No one acted. Aliyah didn't think. She moved. She dropped to her knees beside the man, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. His pulse was weak, his breath shallow. "He's in cardiac distress," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "Someone call an ambulance. Now." I'm calling," the man with the phone stammered, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the screen. Aliyah ignored him, tilting the unconscious man's head back to check his airway. "We need an AED," she said, scanning the crowd. No one moved. "A defibrillator. Most cafes have them. Go get it." A young barista standing near the entrance hesitated, eyes darting between Aliyah and the fallen man. "Now," Aliyah snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. The barista jumped and bolted inside. She placed her hands over the man's chest and began compressions. 1, 2, 3 her training took over, pushing everything else from her mind. But then, wait, what the hell is she doing? The voice sliced through the air like a blade, sharp with suspicion. Aliyah's hands didn't falter, but her pulse spiked. "She's ussy," she's going through his pockets. The accusation sent a ripple through the crowd. Aliyah felt her breath catch, but she kept her rhythm. "She's not helping him," another voice chimed in, a woman's this time, laced with fear. She could be robbing him. Aliyah's vision tunneled. She had spent 6 years saving lives. 6 years holding hands with the dying, comforting families, sacrificing everything to help people. And now, as she fought to keep this man's heart beating, they thought she was. She forced the rage down, pressing harder. 1, 2, 3. Someone stop her. Back off. The new voice boomed over the noise, deep, commanding, and filled with a fury that matched her own. The crowd stilled. Aliyah barely registered the tall man who had appeared beside her, his presence solid as stone. "She's a nurse," he growled, his dark eyes locking onto the accuser. "If any of you had a damn ounce of sense, you'd be thanking her instead of spewing this bullshit." Silence. The man on the ground gasped. Aliyah nearly sagged in relief as his chest rose, his breath rattling but there. The barista rushed out, ED in hand, and Aliyah quickly prepped the machine, attaching the pads just as the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the man who had spoken up for her. She didn't look at any of them. She just stood, hands trembling, and walked away. Aliyah's heart was still pounding when she reached her apartment. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the key, the weight of everything crashing down on her all at once. The cold accusations from the crowd still clung to her skin, the disbelief in their eyes burning like a brand. "She's going through his pockets." The words echoed in her head, over and over, scraping against the raw edges of her exhaustion, her anger. She had been saving that man's life. Saving him. And yet, in their eyes, she had been nothing more than a thief, an opportunist, someone to be distrusted simply because of the color of her skin. She shoved the door open and stepped inside, locking it behind her before pressing her back against the wood, exhaling sharply. Her apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a window that rattled whenever the wind blew too hard, but it was hers. It was supposed to be her sanctuary. But tonight it felt suffocating, the walls closing in, the silence deafening. Her gaze fell on the stack of unopened bills on the kitchen counter. The red letters stamped across the envelopes felt like a silent accusation. Final notice. Past due. Urgent. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against them. She had no job. No savings. No backup plan. And now, after what had happened today, she didn't even have the strength to figure out what came next. She needed to clear her head. She needed sleep. But sleep never came easily. When she finally drifted off, it was restless, filled with flashes of cold pavement, the lifeless face of the man she had saved, the venom in the voices of the people who had doubted her. The pounding on her door jolted her awake. Aaliyah shot up, heart racing, pulse hammering against her ribs. She glanced at the clock. 7:12 a.m. The knocking came again, firm, unrelenting. Her body moved on instinct, adrenaline surging as she grabbed her phone and crept toward the door. Peering through the peephole, her breath caught in her throat. 4 sleek, black luxury cars were parked outside her building, lined up along the curb like they had been ripped straight from some billionaire's private fleet. The early morning sun reflected off their polished surfaces, blinding against the gray backdrop of her worn-down apartment complex. And standing directly outside her door, dressed in a sharp navy suit and looking completely out of place in this part of town, was the man from yesterday, the one who had defended her. Marcus Bennett. Her fingers hovered over the lock. She hesitated. What the hell was he doing here? Another knock, this time softer. Aaliyah Carter. His voice was deep, smooth, carrying the kind of confidence that only came from a lifetime of knowing people listened when you spoke. She steeled herself, then unlatched the door and pulled it open just enough to meet his gaze. Up close, he was even more striking, tall, broad-shouldered, his tailored suit, his eyes dark and assessing, flicked over her quickly, taking in her worn hoodie, the exhaustion still clinging to her features. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled, just slightly. Didn't mean to wake you up this early. Aaliyah crossed her arms. Then what the hell are you doing outside my apartment with a damn motorcade? His smile widened just a fraction, amusement flickering across his face. Figured a phone call wouldn't be enough. She stared at him. Enough for what? He exhaled, glancing over his shoulder at the waiting cars before turning back to her. My father, William Bennett, the man you saved yesterday. He wants to see you. Aaliyah blinked. The name hit her like a slow-moving freight train. William Bennett. She had heard of him before. Everyone had. A self-made millionaire. Hospital investor. One of the wealthiest men in Chicago. She frowned. Is he okay? He's stable, Marcus said. Thanks to you. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Marcus studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the cars. Come with me. Have breakfast with me. Let me explain. Everything about this was surreal. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been shoved out of her job, humiliated by a crowd of strangers, unsure of what the hell she was going to do next. Now a millionaire's son was standing outside her door, asking her to get into one of his luxury cars. Aaliyah glanced at the bills on the counter, the weight of reality pressing against her ribs. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust any of this, but right now she didn't have much left to lose. She grabbed her coat. Fine, she said. Let's go. The car ride was quiet at first, the hum of the engine smooth beneath them as the city blurred past. Aaliyah sat stiffly in the back seat of the sleek black vehicle, her hands pressed together in her lap, her body coiled tight like a wire ready to snap. The leather smelled expensive, the kind of luxury she had only ever seen in passing on TV, in magazines, parked outside places she never had the time or money to step into. Now she was inside one, being driven to an unknown destination by a man she had met less than 24 hours ago, a man whose father she had saved without even seeing his face. Marcus sat beside her, effortlessly composed, one arm resting against the window, his fingers tapping idly against his knee. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel his presence, the weight of his quiet observation. He had barely said a word since they got into the car, and Aaliyah wasn't sure if that made her more or less uneasy. She exhaled, forcing herself to break the silence. So where exactly are we going? Marcus glanced at her, his dark eyes cool and unreadable. A cafe. Private, quiet, good coffee. Aaliyah arched a brow. You showed up at my door at 7 in the morning to take me out for coffee. He smirked slightly. It's more than that. My father wants to meet you, but he's still recovering. In the meantime, I wanted to talk to you myself." She folded her arms, shifting to face him fully. "Why?" He studied her for a moment, then said, "Because yesterday you saved the most important man in my life, and I doubt you even knew who he was. You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask for anything. And then you walked away before anyone could even thank you." Aliyah felt her jaw tighten. "I didn't do it for a thank you." "I know." His voice was quiet, thoughtful. "That's what makes this different." The car slowed, pulling up to a side entrance of a high-end cafe in the heart of downtown. Even from the outside, Aliyah could tell it was the kind of place where people like her didn't just walk in. The building itself was unassuming, sleek and modern, with tinted windows that kept prying eyes out. Two suited men stood near the entrance, not obvious security, but definitely there for a reason. The driver stepped out first, opening the door for them. Marcus slid out effortlessly, adjusting his cuffs as he stood, then turned back, waiting. Aliyah hesitated, her gut instinct screaming at her to be cautious, but she wasn't stupid. She knew when to listen and when to take a risk. And right now, she had nothing left to lose. She stepped out. The moment they entered, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The cafe was nearly empty, the only patrons seated in discreet corners, their conversations hushed, their designer coats draped over the backs of plush leather chairs. No loud espresso machines, no cashiers calling out orders, just quiet efficiency, the kind of place where people had meetings worth millions over a single cup of coffee. Marcus led her to a private corner booth, sliding in across from her. Almost instantly, a waiter appeared, placing 2 steaming cups of coffee in front of them without a single word. Aliyah stared at the cup, then at Marcus. "You just assume I drink coffee." He smirked, lifting his own cup. "I assume that if I woke you up at 7 in the morning, caffeine wouldn't be the worst idea." She huffed but didn't argue. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her fingers, grounding her. "All right," she said, cutting through the pleasantries. "Talk." Marcus set his cup down and leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "My father wants to thank you properly. He's a private man, but what you did yesterday, it's not something he takes lightly." Aliyah frowned. "I don't need money." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "This isn't about needing it. It's about what you deserve." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is from him." Aliyah didn't move. She knew what was inside before she even opened it. "I told you," she said slowly. "I didn't do this for a reward." Marcus exhaled, rubbing a hand along his jaw as he studied her. "I believe that. But my father isn't just offering you a check and sending you on your way. He looked into you." That sent a jolt through her. Her fingers twitched against the ceramic cup. "Excuse me." "He knows you lost your job. He knows what happened yesterday. And he knows you should be a doctor, not a nurse who just got screwed over by a system that was never built for people like you." Aliyah's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded in her ears, a sharp, defensive instinct flaring up inside her. And what, exactly, does he want in return? Marcus leaned back, watching her carefully. "Nothing. Just for you to take what he's offering. He wants to fund your education, put you through med school, no strings attached. And when you're done, there will be a position waiting for you at one of his private hospitals." Silence stretched between them. Aliyah felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. She looked down at the envelope, at the weight of what it represented. A way out. A way forward. A chance at everything she had worked for, dreamed of everything that had been ripped away from her in a single conversation with Whitmore. But nothing in life came free. Nothing was ever just an act of kindness. She met Marcus's gaze, searching for the catch, the hidden angle. Why would he do this for me? Marcus tilted his head, considering his words carefully. Then he said, "Because my father knows what it's like to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to have doors shut in his face for no reason other than the fact that he didn't fit the image of what they wanted, and because he saw something in you that reminded him of himself." Aliyah's throat tightened. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay composed, to think, to weigh her options like she always did. But for the first time in a long time, she couldn't find a reason to say no. She picked up the envelope, running her fingers over its edges, feeling the weight of a future she never thought she'd be handed. And then, quietly, she said, "Okay." Aliyah turned the business card between her fingers, the edges crisp, the embossed lettering smooth beneath her touch. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried something more than just an invitation. It carried expectation, possibility. A path she had never thought would open for her. She set the card down next to the envelope, her pulse still uneven, her thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and cautious hope. Marcus watched her, his expression unreadable, patient. He had given her the space to process, but now, as the silence stretched between them, he leaned forward, his voice measured. "I know this is a lot, and I know you're probably still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But there's no catch, Aliyah. This isn't some debt waiting to be collected. My father isn't doing this for PR, and I'm not here to convince you of anything you don't want." Aliyah exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "It's not that simple." Marcus tilted his head, studying her. "Why not?" She scoffed, the bitter edge of old disappointments slipping into her voice before she could stop them. "Because things like this don't happen to people like me. We don't just get rescued. We work. We hustle. We fight for every damn thing we have. And even then, it's still not enough." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she clenched her jaw, hating that he had seen it, hating that for a moment her walls had slipped. Marcus didn't look away. He didn't offer empty reassurances or tell her she was wrong. He just nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "You're right," he said. "It's not fair. You should have never had to fight this hard just to be given what you've already earned. But that's exactly why you should take this." Aliyah swallowed hard, her chest tight. Marcus gestured toward the envelope. "Look, you don't owe us anything. You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You've already done that. You saved a man's life when everyone else stood around and did nothing. You deserve this." She wanted to believe that. God, she wanted to. She reached for the envelope again, running her thumb over the seal, feeling the weight of her own hesitation pressing against her ribs. Marcus leaned back, watching her carefully. Then, with a small smirk, he added, "Besides, if you don't take it, my father's just going to find another way to put that money in your hands. He's stubborn like that." Aliyah let out a short, breathy laugh, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly. "Sounds like a family trait." Marcus grinned, something warm flickering behind his eyes. "You have no idea." She looked at him then, really looked at him. The man who had stood up for her when no one else had. The man who had shown up at her door before the sun had fully risen. Because a simple phone call wouldn't have been enough. He had seen her, in a way most people never did. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth trusting. She let out a slow breath, then nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "I'm in." Marcus's smile widened, something satisfied in the way he nodded. He reached for his coffee, lifting it slightly in an unspoken toast. "Good," he said. "Welcome to the next chapter of your life, Aliyah Carter." Aliyah picked up her own cup, holding it for a beat before taking a slow sip. For the first time in a long, long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story was finally changing. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.